First of all, is the microphone about right? Can everybody hear me without yelling? Okay, great. I want to say, first of all, that I hope that a book can be judged by its cover, particularly since a Hingham artist is the creator of it. Joan Broncoli is probably known to many of you. She's a Hingham resident, a good friend, member of the Copley Society in Boston, and I think she's done a terrific job with that. I should say, first of all, you know, somebody told me recently that there were 13,000 books written about Lincoln, and this being my second, there are now 13,002. And as I say in the introduction, I think you need a reason to write another book about Lincoln, and I had two. The first was just a real curiosity about what it was actually like to live and work and be entertained and do business in Lincoln's White House. I've read a lot of Lincoln, a lot of history in general, and there is no such book before this one. I really tried to weave together the research that I did to create a sense of what it's like to be there, to actually live the experience of being in Lincoln's White House. So it's just curiosity to start with, and to see Lincoln in a new perspective, as a boss, as a father, a husband, an administrator, all of that. And the second thing as I got into the research was to develop the ways in which Lincoln learned over time to use the White House as a tool in three basic ways, as I found. One was the subtitle is The People's House in Wartime, and that first reason, or that first way of using it as a tool, was to in fact open it up to the public, which we'll get into, and to make it a kind of a bonding agent for the people of the United States and the government of the United States. The second way was to use it as a platform for the war, to support the war and encourage support of the war. And the third was as a tool for racial progress, which was really quite remarkable, and we'll get into all three of those things. I don't expect to stand up here and give an academic lecture, but I hope you'll see those three themes sort of working their way through as we go through the material. The White House Historical Association provided a lot of the images that we're going to see tonight, as did the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum in Springfield, which is a great place if you ever get a chance to go out there. Also, a website called The Civil War in Color, which is a terrific thing to just browse through. He also sells these images. A man by the name of David Richardson, who's very talented at this thing. He uses Photoshop technology to take black and white photographs and colorize them with pretty amazing results. For example, this is William Tecumseh Sherman. When I showed that slide down south in my last book tour, I got an audible kind of gasp from the audience when they saw Sherman in the flesh. And General George Meade, who the victor at the Battle of Gettysburg. When you see these images, you get a sense of these folks as people in a way that you never do with black and white photography, because we're just not used to seeing black and white anymore. Both Sherman and Meade were guests at Lincoln's White House and conferred with him there. But I think I should tell you that the military part of the story occurs off camera throughout this book. The book is almost entirely focused on the four walls of the White House and what goes on inside the White House, which is also different. You know, most of these books focus in on the military. There's certainly a military element here, but most of it is secondary, and all of it is off camera. I think where we should start is a restored photograph of Lincoln's White House, which I think it's fair to say, the thought occurred to me as I was writing the book that Lincoln's White House is sort of strange and familiar at the same time. You know, it's a familiar sight. We're certainly well accustomed to seeing the White House, but it's strange as well. It is in the book and it is in this photograph, if you look carefully. There's no Washington Monument behind it, as you would see today. There's no East Wing, there's no West Wing. There's no fountain in the middle. There is instead what one of Lincoln's aides called a statue of Jefferson that looked more like a moldy old Indian just dug up. The shrubbery around the Indian is very informal. I think most of us can do better than that in our front lawns. There was not the same kind of attention to this sort of thing in those days. And I think it's also worth noticing this photograph was taken in the summer, and if you look at, if I get this straight, if you look at the windows, you'll see that they're all open. I'd like to start us off with a sense of some of the differences between Lincoln's day and ours, and the comfort level of life in general, but particularly life in Lincoln's White House, in which on a summer day you would either leave those windows closed and get steamed like a head of broccoli, or open them up and get eaten alive by the mosquitoes and the other creatures. This was a letter written by one of Lincoln's aides, who we'll talk about a bit later, John George Nicolay, his private secretary, who wrote to his fiancée on a hot Sunday night. "The gas lights over my desk are burning brightly, and the windows are open, and all Bugdom seems to have organized a storming party to take the gas light. It is only just possible to endure. The air is swarming with them. They are on the ceiling, the walls, and the furniture in countless numbers. They are buzzing around the room and butting their heads against the window panes. They are on my clothes, in my hair, and on the sheet I am writing on." I don't think Barack Obama has to worry about mosquitoes. There are other things he has to worry about, but not that. This is a long shot of the White House, taken from 15th Street. You can see the White House there. Here is the Treasury Department that's still there. Right over here would have been the half-built stub of the Washington Monument. We no longer have cattle grazing on the mall. I guess you could get a parking space on the mall in those days. And off in the distance, you see the Maryland branch of the Shenandoah Mountains, which you cannot see today, I promise you, because of all that lack of development. There's basically almost no development in Washington at this time, except right around the Capitol building, right around the White House, and down Pennsylvania Avenue. One thing I tried to do in the research was to find as many foreign accounts of what was going on in Washington at the time, largely English travelers, English journalists, because you get a unique perspective from an outsider, somebody coming in fresh, looking at it with fresh eyes, as close to what you would get if we were looking at it. And I have in the book that for the English novelist Anthony Trollope, Washington City, as it was called then, was, quote, "a straggling congregation of buildings in a wilderness, a ragged, unfinished collection of unbuilt broad streets, as to the completion of which there can now, I imagine, be but little hope." The American correspondent for the Times of London, William Howard Russell, referred to Washington as this preposterous capital. So you can get some sense of what Washington was like in the 1860s as compared to what it's like now. Trollope also spoke about the statue of Jackson, and many of you will have seen the statue in Lafayette Square right across the street from the White House, where it still stands today. Trollope thought the horsemanship, quote, "most absurd, but the man sitting on the horse is manifestly drunk. I should think the time must come when this figure, at any rate, will be removed." This is an overhead projection, a kind of bird's eye drawing of the President's house, as it was called formerly in those days, and the grounds. Some of it is aspirational, meaning that it hadn't yet been done, and some of it never would be done, but most of it is accurate. You have, first of all, the White House in the middle. This was done, by the way, in the late 1850s. You can see the relatively underdeveloped state of the real estate around the White House. A lot of open space, a lot of backyards, gardens and such, where there are now very substantial buildings. Here is the Treasury Department, which at that point was only on the drawing board, now exists almost exactly as you see it there. But the War Department on this side never was built. It was meant to be a mirror image of the Treasury Department, never actually got built. Instead, there's that kind of wedding cake Victorian executive office building there now that was built in the 1880s and 90s. Over here, you've got what's called Jefferson's Wall, because Jefferson had it built. It was a stone wall that kind of marked the boundary of what was called the President's Park, which was all of this. The ellipse, that as we know it, is not this. This is a racetrack that was not actually used as a racetrack. And in fact, at the time, and well into Lincoln's time, and after Lincoln's time, there was basically nothing there but grass. And here below Jefferson's Wall was essentially a junkyard. Just piles of trash, big chunks of lumber. Lincoln used to take his young aides down there with some of the new weapons that were being tested and actually fire them down there in a kind of a test range. They had some pretty good insights, but they also made some mistakes. One of the inventions that one of Lincoln's aides described as a little ball of iron hollowed out in the middle with cross-hatching around the outside of it, stuffed with gunpowder and a fuse. And supposedly you would light this fuse and throw it at the enemy, which Lincoln and his aides said would work great if the enemy would just stand still long enough for you to throw it at them. So they thought that was a joke, and the prototype hand grenade became a paperweight on Lincoln's desk. This, in fact, is Jefferson's Wall, that young man sitting there on the left. You can see that graffiti was popular at that time as well as our own. And you can see these children playing on the lawn. The speculation is that they're Tad and Willie Lincoln, who we'll get to in a minute, and their friends. Over here in the corner is the conservatory, which of course no longer exists, taken down many years ago and replaced by the West Wing, which now extends, of course, over into this area where the Oval Office is, and none of that existed in Lincoln's time. The conservatory was at first open to the public. Was a beautiful place with exotic flowers, tropical plants, oranges, strawberries, all of which Mrs. Lincoln in particular loved and would package up and send to her friends with these miraculous gifts, you know, in January and February of fresh flowers and fruit. It was then closed to the public when one of the aides said later that they had opened it up with the presumption that the public would be above stealing flowers from the president. And that presumption proved rebuttable, as we say in the law. So they then closed it off to the public, and only the president and his family and their guests would use it. This is a photograph taken in the conservatory. About a dozen Plains Indian chiefs came to the White House to meet the president and to negotiate and talk about peace and such. These are the wives of diplomats who came to the event, which was very well publicized and very much left people with their jaws agape. You can see this child here, one of the diplomats' children. There's others behind her. In the corner are two of those diplomats. This is Lincoln's private secretary, George Nicolay, who we'll get to later, and that's Mrs. Lincoln. There's a long story about this that's in the book, and I'll give you the real brief version of it. These Indians were brought into the East Room. They sat on the floor in a circle. They were surrounded by these diplomats and their families and their children. They wheeled out a globe and told them where their land was and where the Washington was, and they nodded, but they didn't seem to buy it. They were given peace medals by Lincoln and certificates of friendship. They went home. Several of these chiefs in this picture, Cheyenne, flew the American flag from their village. And about a year after they came home with that flag flying, a cavalry troop of Colorado militia came storming at them. One of those chiefs came out to greet them with his peace medal and his certificate, was shot from his horse and killed, and the village was pretty well wiped out. It was later called the Sand Creek Massacre. Ironically enough, Lincoln had given them a speech about how the white men were less warlike than their red brothers while they were involved in a civil war. This is the stable that used to be right behind the White House. This looks kind of incongruous to us now. There was a fire in that stable. In 1864, Lincoln went running out of the house while his soldiers that were in the back there had their hands in their pockets, as it was later described, went leaping over that fence like a deer, one of them said, and tried to pull open the doors and get the animals out, but was dragged back because the place was engulfed in flames. Turned out that what he was trying to do was save one of his children's ponies, which he did not succeed in doing. These are the lawnmowers that were used exactly for that purpose. The public was welcome on the south lawn of the White House. They were welcome on the front lawn as well, every day except Sunday, day or night. It was an open public park. Anybody who wanted to could come and walk or ride through that area. There were band concerts there in the summers that were very popular events. People would occupy that entire south lawn and listen to the music. Sometimes Lincoln would come out there on the south portico and listen himself until he was besieged, and then he would go back in the Blue Room and listen in the Blue Room and say to people how he wished he could just listen and not be annoyed. But that's the burden of the presidency, I guess. This is a contemporary map of Washington at the time. You can see again that that pretty scarce development right around the White House, and then as you get a few blocks away, you see there's almost nothing at all. And as this map goes up and around, it's basically open farmland from about that point on in all directions, completely undeveloped. The thing I want to draw your attention to in particular is the canal here that ran at the time along Constitution Avenue, what's now Constitution Avenue. This is the mall as we know it today. There's the Washington Monument, which was half built at the time. And this was, access to the Potomac. The problem was that all of this had been closed off about 25 years earlier. The canal had been a commercial failure. They closed it off. And we know what happens to stagnant water in a place like Washington in the summer. It was not a pleasant environment. And you can see the proximity to the White House. And those band concerts were not a very pleasant place to be on a hot August day, nor was the Executive Mansion. John Hay, who is going to come up a little later, a young aide of Lincoln's, wrote home to his family saying that he was writing this letter on a hot August night, surrounded by the ghosts of 20,000 dead cats. This is a rear view of the White House, taken actually years before Lincoln's time, but unchanged after that. And if you look at the area here, the kind of ground floor, which still exists today, it was called the basement at the time. Partly because the ground slopes down from Pennsylvania Avenue. So you'd have this kind of walkout area here and a basement area here with just high windows, that couldn't be used unless you stood up on a chair. They called it the basement then it was more like a basement than it is today. Today they have the diplomatic reception room, other formal rooms there that are very much a part of the ceremonial White House. At the time, one of Lincoln's aides said that the basement smelled like something on the edge of a swamp and infested with rats. But that said, the basement floor plan shows you that where the furnace was, where the coal bins were, the furnace was a state-of-the-art coal-fired furnace, very high-end, very sophisticated for its time, as were all of the systems in the White House. I spent a lot of time researching that, really wanted to know about the nuts and bolts of the place. And it turned out it was all very much cutting-edge technology. There was hot and cold running water in all the rooms. There were flush toilets in many of the rooms, although not all. There was a kind of a swing swivel sink in every bedroom where when you pulled the swivel out, the water would flow, and when you pulled it back, the water would stop. And of course, it was gaslit at the time, but it was the very best gaslit piping and lighting that was available. The lights, however, did go out at 9 o'clock. So when the coal-fired gas plant shut down, so you had to do whatever reading you were going to do by candlelight after that. I will tell you too that the kitchen is in the same place where the kitchen is today. We'll take a quick look at that in a moment. The servants' quarters were in the wings off to the side here, and the the vignette I wanted to tell you about in the book is the breakdown of a pump one morning. The water pump in the basement broke down that circulated the water in the White House. Lincoln called up an engineer officer, a captain, found one that knew something about pumps, went down there with him, rolled up his sleeve, took out a monkey wrench, and helped him fix the pump, and then had him up for lunch afterward. So, hands-on President of the United States. This is a shot of the scullery, which was adjacent to the kitchen a few years after Lincoln's time, but essentially unchanged since Lincoln's time. They had, in those days, sawdust on the floor to catch the grease that might drop over from whatever source, and the fireplace and also the stove had never gone out. The light in those stove and fireplace had never gone out since John Adams moved in 1800. They kept it as a kind of a sacred flame. This is the floor plan of the ceremonial first floor in Lincoln's day, which is very much the same as it is today. There's very little difference as you look around that floor plan. I do want to point out a couple of things. One is the interior stairway, which no longer exists, and also the servants' stairway, which was entirely hidden from view in every room. And Lincoln liked to use that stairway because he would be able to get up and down without anybody seeing him. And as we'll see in a few moments, there were a lot of people to hide from. The vestibule is still pretty much the same as it is today, but there was at the time a little storm entrance that was made out of just plain old glass like you might get at Home Depot. Lincoln called it the coop. As you walked in, it would look pretty much like a chicken coop. And off to the side there, the porter's lodge, as it's called, was the place where the servants, not the servants, the two doorkeepers, there were two doorkeepers who serviced the vestibule. One was a small, about 70-year-old Irishman, from the old country, very humorous, sort of sarcastic, but conniving Irish stereotype, I guess, a little leprechaun. And he would share that porter's lodge with his assistant. Edward McManus was the principal doorman, who stood about 5'2", and his assistant Burns was 6'3". So they were kind of Mudd and Jeff team. Both of them just characters, conniving and playing and having fun with everyone. That little window that you see looking out of the porter's lodge is the only protection that the White House had. Edward McManus and Burns would look out that window to see who was coming and, lock the door if they had any suspicions. That was the extent of the security in Lincoln's Civil War White House throughout most of the time that he was president. We'll come to the minor changes a little later. This is an engraving of a reception of Lincoln's in the East Room, and although superficially it seems to be very much like the East Room today, and of course it is in some ways, but that is a very much romanticized view of what the White House, even in the ceremonial main floor, was like in 1861 when the Lincolns moved in. One of the staff people who came from Springfield with Lincoln said it had the ambiance of a third-class hotel. Sort of frayed rugs, tawdry old curtains, peeling wallpaper, handprints on the doors, greasy handprints. Mrs. Lincoln called it that dilapidated mansion that we found when we arrived. She had expected something palatial, and it was far from that. She said there was not a single stick of furniture in the house that she would have had in her Springfield home. And in addition to the wear and tear and the general tawdiness, there were souvenir hunters who would come in and cut swatches off the curtains, pieces off the chairs, carve the finials off the furniture. Sometimes they'd come in pairs, and one person would distract Edward McManus while another skinned a sofa or something of that kind. So this is you can imagine the condition of this house when the Lincolns moved in. The upstairs, I think, is actually a lot more interesting than the downstairs, which is very different than it is today, at least in many respects. The president's bedroom here, his dressing room here. Mrs. Lincoln had an adjoining bedroom, which was fashionable among upper and upper middle class people at the time. Over here is called the Prince of Wales room, where the Prince of Wales had stayed under Buchanan's administration. There are some bedrooms here, the bathroom here, and here was the bedroom of Lincoln's two senior aides, Nicolay and Hay. We'll talk about them in a moment. The office of Nicolay and that he shared with William Stoddard, a junior aide. Here was the waiting room where people would come to wait to see Lincoln. Sometimes they'd be in the hall. Here you have the library, which is still pretty much a library in the upstairs of the current White House. And here is the president's office, which is now referred to as the Lincoln bedroom. It never was Lincoln's bedroom. He never slept there. It was his office. It had been the office of many other presidents, at least back to John Adams. Well, John Adams was the first resident. And off to the side is his private secretary's office, George Nicolay. The condition of the office, this is an engraving of Buchanan's office the year before Lincoln took over. And for the first 2 years of his administration, he made no changes whatsoever. Totally indifferent to his surroundings. Couldn't have told that room from the East Room because he just didn't care and didn't look. But it was described by a congressman who came to visit him shortly after he took office as tawdry, not particularly clean, and looking like nothing more than the breaking up of a hard winter. The furniture had all passed down through many presidents, if not all the presidents. Not that anybody revered it. One newspaper said it was too rickety to venerate. And it was infused constantly with the smell of cigars, stale cigars, cigar smoke. You can imagine being almost unable to breathe. Not the Oval Office. This is a photograph of Lincoln in that office. Very unusual in those days to have an interior photograph. They had to make a long exposure. He stood there inflexibly for a long time while they made it. The little writing desk there is where he would do his work. I'm sorry, I misspoke. That's the cabinet table, and you'll see a bigger shot of that later, where the cabinet would meet. His writing desk was in the corner here, with books and such piled up against an interior door. Totally with no extra niceties at all. This is a contemporary cartoon, which I'm not so much interested in the content, although it's an anti-war content, as the very accurate rendition of Lincoln at his desk. Somebody had seen him in that office. He would typically sit pretty much with one leg over a chair, sometimes with both legs over a chair, sometimes laying across two chairs, in all kinds of ridiculous postures. One visiting woman said it looked as if he were deformed, the way he was sitting when she met him. He would always have papers and books and things laying around the top of his desk, a wicker wastebasket at the bottom overflowing with one thing or another. So that's what you would have seen when you walked into Lincoln's office. One of his backwoods cousins came to see him from literally from the woods out west. Hadn't seen him since they were kids, and he wrote home that when he walked in, Abe was sitting at a desk that wasn't worth 2 bits, quote unquote. This is a contemporary photograph of the White House from the outside, obviously with people who happened to be standing there at the time. It was one of 2 cobblestone streets in the city of Washington, D.C. The mud would flow into Pennsylvania Avenue from the dirt streets that crossed it. Every street in Washington was dirt except Pennsylvania Avenue and 17th Street. An Englishman said that the mud was so thick that people would try to avoid crossing the street if they could at any cost. The Englishman said it was not thick enough to walk on, nor thin enough to swim in. But there was an advantage on Pennsylvania Avenue because it was paved and you could touch bottom there, is what the Englishman said. The other thing to keep in mind here is that any one of those people could have walked through the gates which are just off camera here and over here as they are today, and walked into the White House anytime they felt like it. And many did, constantly. The doors were always open. Anybody who wanted to could come in. If you wanted to see the president, you could walk in the front door, go up the steps, sit in that waiting room for a while, and get in and see the president of the United States in the middle of a civil war. It might take you a while, it might take you a day or two, but if you were patient, you would get in to see him. There was a dinner for Prince Napoleon, a cousin of the Emperor of France, Napoleon III, and a nephew of the original Napoleon, who arrived with his entourage at about noon, as expected, to meet Lincoln and Seward, his Secretary of State, and came up to the door, was astonished to see that there was nobody there to meet him, nobody outside, nobody sort of lined up, no honor guard. Finally, he said, we just opened the door and walked in as one would enter a cafe. He could not believe it. He walked into the vestibule, as you saw, waited for somebody to come. Nobody did. Finally, little Willie Lincoln came running by, happened to be there, and ran up and got his father, and down came Lincoln down the stairs. Prince Napoleon said that the president has the bearing of a bootmaker. Was not impressed with any of it. He also wrote home that he'd had a bad dinner in the French style. Nathaniel Hawthorne was one of the visitors to Lincoln's White House, and we speak of him now because I think he helps illustrate what it was like to visit there if you were inclined to see the president. He arrived with a delegation of whip makers from Massachusetts. Of course, he's a Massachusetts resident at the time, lived in Concord, and had linked up with this delegation of whip makers who were going in to see the president, and was with another well-known author at the time, someone we would not recognize today. He was an international celebrity at the time. You know, the Scarlet Letter and the House of Seven Gables were very, very big-time popular books, even in his day. Nobody showed him any particular notice. Lincoln didn't behave as if he was different than anyone else. What they did is they walked into the lobby. Some people did recognize him, kind of latched on to the little delegation. They went up the stairs. Some more people latched on, some of them in workman's clothes, he says. And by the time they walked into Lincoln's office, there were about 20 of them, all unknown to each other. He writes, we formed a very miscellaneous collection of people, mostly unknown to each other, and without any common sponsor, but all with an equal right to look our head of state in the face. Lincoln ambled in and greeted them and the congressman that had escorted them. Hawthorne says he was dressed in shabby slippers, an old frock coat, and unbrushed matching pants worn so faithfully that the suit had become a second skin. He looked as if he had just gotten out of bed. Hawthorne then goes out to say that he had other things to recount, but that he didn't think that they would bear repetition in a reception room or in the immaculate pages of The Atlantic that he was writing for. And in fact, The Atlantic didn't think what he had written was immaculate enough and purged out all the good stuff before it appeared. There were also weekly receptions called levees at the time where anyone who wanted to could come in and attend these weekly receptions, typically on a Friday evening. Lincoln would stand there at the head of the reception line, shake your hand as you came through. Sometimes he would shake as many as 200 or 300 or 400 hands, at a time. You see this woman here curtsying to Mrs. Lincoln. You see that the two aides here behind him. And although this is a formal kind of group and officers in dress uniforms, ordinary folks would mingle with that crowd and come in their ordinary clothes. Mrs. Lincoln said as long as you were clean and neat, you were welcome. And people came freely. This then is George Nicolay, Lincoln's private secretary. He's 29 years old. And as private secretary to the President of the United States, he made a presidential staff of one. There was one authorized staff member budgeted by Congress for the President of the United States, and Nicolay was it. He was 29 years old, German-born to illiterate peasants in Germany, who migrated to this country, wound up in Illinois. He had no education to speak of at all. Similar to Lincoln, he had teamed up with the owners of a local newspaper, which he called the Poor Man's College, where he learned to write and to be really a quite capable writer. He was, in the parlance of the time, as one of the reporters called him, a difficult man with a slow smile and a silent, methodical German way about him. But in that sort of pithy way that he had, the one thing he said about Lincoln after he left the White House was there was never any red tape between us. Lincoln trusted him implicitly, and Nicolay was a kind of a no-nonsense fellow. He did have an assistant, John Hay, who was not an official White House employee. There was only one official employee, but Lincoln had Hay assigned to the Interior Department and then brought over from the Interior Department as a designated clerk, a little bureaucratic trick that he learned and used repeatedly after that. Hay was all of 22 years old when he held that position. Another young man from Illinois. He had been learning the law, reading the law as they called it, in an office that adjoined Lincoln's. Lincoln took a shine to him, and he wound up where he did. He was a doctor's son, had gone to Brown. At the time, there were 200 students at Brown and 11 faculty. Was elected the class poet, and was not only a son to a doctor, but a son to Lincoln. Lincoln really treated him as a second son, called him John. He's the only person we know of that he called by his first name. They always typically used the last name, either Mr. Jones or Jones if they were friends, but Hay was John. Hay is, as my wife knows, my favorite Lincoln character, including Lincoln. I think he's a fascinating guy, and as we finish this up, we'll hear a little bit more from John Hay. Really a brilliant mind and a fascinating conversationalist. One of his friends says the following: "It was simply impossible to talk to him at any length of time without him saying something that delighted you inexpressibly, something you couldn't wait to take to others to delight them too. In casual conversation, he would drop his little gems as if he owed their inspiration to the listener. Everyone who spent half an hour with him was sure to go away not only charmed with John Hay, but uncommonly well pleased with himself." That strikes me as the perfect conversationalist. I should say, too, that baby face was well known at the time. One leathery old politician said that John was quite the ladies' man, and with a suitable change of garb could have passed as a lady's maid. This is his calling card that he had made up in the style of the day. You'd have your photograph taken as a calling card, and he wrote home that to him it resembled the desperate attempts of a tipsy man trying to look sober, which I think it kind of does, actually. The third and final young aide of Lincoln was a fellow by the name of William Stoddard, another Interior Department employee assigned to the White House to handle correspondence primarily, 25 years old, also from Illinois. So you've got 29, 25, and 22 are the sum total of Abraham Lincoln's presidential staff in the Civil War. Stoddard handled primarily the mail, and in that capacity, he wrote that the first thing a man does when he goes clean crazy is to sit down and write a letter to the President of the United States. They received about once a week a letter from the angel Gabriel, written in blood, that Stoddard said looked suspiciously like an inferior brand of red ink. And Stoddard also said that the angel Gabriel had not learned to spell in heaven, apparently. There was a slot. There were slots on his correspondence desk for all sorts of different things: generals, admirals, government officials, and such. One of those slots was marked "crazy" and "poetry." So that's it. 3 aides, all in their 20s, the sum total of Lincoln's staff. One of the problems that the Lincolns had from the beginning was a snobbishness on the part of the Bostonians, the New Yorkers, and the Philadelphians, who thought of these people as barely out of the woods, sort of semi-savage, one of whom was our own Charles Henry Dana of Boston, the author of 2 Years Before the Mast. Dana wrote at the time, coming into the White House and meeting the President and the First Lady, that Mrs. Lincoln looked like the housekeeper of the establishment, and not a particularly attractive housekeeper at that. And he said that Abe, old Abe as he called him, looked like a man who had come in with something to sell. So this is the sort of impression that the Lincolns tended to make on the establishment at the time. Mrs. Lincoln is a story unto herself. I don't have the beginnings of enough time to talk about that subplot. A very complicated figure, undoubtedly eccentric. Even her supporters would say that. And frankly, the evidence of her outright corruption is overpowering. And I say that as a lawyer. There has been very careful studies done of her bookkeeping, her management of the accounts, which are riddled with things like buying $1,000 cashmere shawls, which is 2 years' wages for an average person, and billing them off as gilded fixtures for the chandeliers, things of that kind. I don't have time to get into all of that, but it's a story in and of itself. She had a very violent temper. It was said by one of their family friends that she came at the president with knives, brooms, hot tea and coffee, and poorly pitched potatoes. That said, she was a real master at refurbishing and restoring the White House, which is a story again in and of itself. And I'll get to some of that in just a minute. She visited military hospitals all the time. She tried to play the appropriate role of a First Lady and set a model for that others would follow. Complicated is the best word I can use to sum up Mary Lincoln. The Lincoln boys here with their uncle, Mary's brother, Willie on the left and Todd on the right, were celebrities at the time. There had never been young children living in the White House within recent memory. There'd only been one 10-year-old many years before, so this was quite the novelty. They would receive all sorts of gifts in the mail. They were utterly undisciplined, both of them, had complete free reign of the White House, would go outside on the back lawn and play with the servants' kids, with the local newsboys, with whatever kids happened to be coming by, just as you would, in your backyard in any other time or place. Willie Lincoln was the older of the two. He was 10 years old when the Lincolns moved in. Described by everyone who knew him as a fun-loving boy, but a very studious boy. He collected railroad tables and would sit on a little desk in a corner of his room, plotting out imaginary railroad trips from wherever he wanted to go to wherever he was going to go, and have them all match up and such. Hay called him a child of great promise. Tad, on the other hand, was quite the hellion, I guess is the word you might use. If you look very carefully, you might see the chin whiskers that he drew on this photograph under his chin. Hay says that Tad was a kind little boy. He was the younger of the two, but perfectly lawless, with a very bad opinion of books and no opinion of discipline. Nicolay said, with a bachelor's opinion of obstreperous children, as he put it, that he could not understand how Lincoln let Tad run through his office whenever he liked, blowing a horn or not, no matter who was there or why. An important senator called him more numerous than popular. He also was a sweet kid and a a very caring, empathetic kid, and he had total disdain for the office seekers, which we'll get to in a moment. Would shake them down for change by all sorts of devices, charge them a nickel to go up the stairway. He once bought all the inventory of a sidewalk gingerbread woman, doubled it up, set up a sawhorse on the front portico, and sold it out in 5 minutes to all the office seekers who were trying to curry favor with the president. But when it came down to the woebegone folks in the waiting room, you know, a poor widow or a wounded soldier or somebody like that, he would pester his father until he had them jump the line. He'd bring them in, he'd plead their cases. Hay called them Tad's clients. And he proved to be a pretty good lawyer for them. Robert Lincoln, the older son of Lincoln's, was at Harvard at the time, and therefore only spent limited amounts of time at the White House. I have a little vignette in the book about him coming down to the White House on a Harvard vacation with a friend. A friend of Mrs. Lincoln comes over in her carriage and is shocked to find the two of these young men romping with Tad on the sofa in the White House. Offended her sensibilities. And then she proceeded to tell Mrs. Lincoln that she had heard that the boys at Cambridge would go into Boston after a snow to watch the girls lift their skirts above the curb to walk across the street. These skirts were toe length, and they would get them up to ankle length, and the boys would come down to watch this. And according to this woman who told Mrs. Lincoln that, she said, "Has Robert ever told you that?" "He wouldn't dare," Mrs. Lincoln said. "Well, has he told you that they call it leg day?" Very exciting stuff in 1863. Robert Lincoln became later, toward the end of the war, after he graduated from Harvard, became a captain in the Army and served on Grant's staff in that capacity. Was actually present when Lee surrendered at Appomattox. So now we come to the office seekers. This is a contemporary cartoon called Gulliver Abe Attacked by the Lilliputian Office Seekers, which mingled in with the ordinary crowds who would come for whatever reason. There were legions of these office seekers that would completely besiege him constantly, like a mob at a failing bank, as I say in the book. He had about 1,500 government jobs to hand out, many of them lucrative, many of them easy, and they were very much in hot demand. Lincoln, also Southerners, before the war began, in April of '61. You know, Lincoln comes in March, the war doesn't begin for a little over a month, and Southerners were coming in for these jobs as well. In fact, Lincoln told a friend that if vacant places could be had at the North Pole, the road to the Arctic Circle would be lined with dead Virginians. Horace Greeley, the editor of the New York Tribune, wrote about that phenomenon. He said, "The thieves hunt in gangs, and each one helps the others to their share of the pickings." There's an interview in the book that Lincoln has with a would-be doorkeeper among this crowd of office seekers outside his office. You can see, by the way, that this is a second-floor waiting room. There's Nicolay's office. That's Lincoln's office. That's the kind of half-moon window that we still see on the end of the White House today. And Lincoln has this interview with a doorkeeper, and he's trying to find a gentle way to tell him you can't give him a job. And he says, "Well, sir, do you have any experience as a doorkeeper?" He says, "Well, not any actual experience, no, Mr. President." He says, "Well, do you have any theoretical experience?" He says, "Yes." He says, "No, I'm afraid I don't." "Well, have you ever read about the ethics and principles of doorkeeping?" He says, "Well, no, Mr. President." "Well, can't you see you're just unqualified for this job?" And they said that the man left almost happily. He could see that, in fact, he was not qualified. Lincoln said himself at one point to a friend, Senator Fessenden of Maine, said that he would turn the federal bayonets on these people if he were president. And Lincoln said that he was not president and that I'm president. And I want to see these people, they want to see me, and it's part of my job to do that. He did say that his biggest fault, he thought, was an inability to say no. Thank God for not making me a woman. Another Massachusetts character, Herman Melville, showed up as one of those office seekers. and wrote about it. He said that at the time he had written this book about a whale that was a total flop, sold a few hundred copies. He was trying to find some way to make a living. He showed up at the White House trying to get a job as an envoy to Florence, Italy, which is where artists and writers were sometimes sent. And strangely enough, an actual diplomat got that job, and Melville didn't. He said, though, that when he went through the receiving line, shaking Lincoln's hand, he said it was like he felt like he was a laborer chopping wood at so much per cord. He had shaken about 800 hands that one night alone. So you can imagine the state of his hand after that. Mrs. Lincoln said there were times when she thought she should take his white kid glove with a pair of tongs and drop it in the fire after shaking many of those unwashed hands. When the war did break out, there was a period of about a week when there was virtually no federal troops in Washington to defend the Capitol. And of course, you've got Virginia right across the river, and very large numbers of Virginia troops forming up. You also had Maryland on the other side of the Capitol, a slave state that was expected to go south, almost did, would have if Lincoln hadn't stopped it. And they were in sheer terror for about a week or 10 days, expecting any day that the city would be overwhelmed by these Confederate troops. There were a total of 64 regular Army troops in the city of Washington at the time, who camped out here in the East Room for that period of time. John Hay said it was the most luxurious barracks that any American troops had ever had. And in addition to those regular troops, they recruited 2 Kansas senators who had newly been elected. Kansas had just been admitted to the Union. One was a fellow by the name of Jim Lane, and another whose name escapes me at the moment. But between the two of them, they were very rugged people, kind of frontier knife fighter types who had gained that Jim Bowie type of reputation, got elected to the Senate. One of their little armies that they assembled of their local retainers was called the Frontier Guard, and the other consisted of what's described by contemporaries as pot-bellied congressmen, nearsighted journalists, and about 150 office seekers who camped out at the White House so that they'd be there in the morning to get the best pickings when the doors opened. They called themselves the Strangler Brigade, and Lincoln insisted that very few of them had ever strangled anyone. But that's all that held the fort, so to speak, defended the White House for about 10 days until the first troops finally arrived about 2 weeks into the war. One of those units were the Fire Zouaves of New York. You can see them trampling on that Confederate flag. They were led by a very close friend, young friend of Lincoln's, who was the first casualty on the northern side and had his funeral in the East Room. When those troops finally arrived, they paraded past the White House in review. You can see Lincoln and his staff and his generals over there under the tent and the flag, a gala celebration. After that, those troops arrived. There were guards posted for the first time at the White House. They were from a unit called the Pennsylvania Bucktails, with deer tails on their hats. And there were also cavalry positioned at both gates. But as one of those cavalrymen said, they were far more decorative than useful, quote unquote. They didn't stop anybody who came down the gate. They didn't stop anybody who went into the door. If you passed between the two of them, they wouldn't give you a second look. So they really were more decorative than useful. Anyone who wanted to could still walk into the White House anytime in the midst of the Civil War, throughout the Civil War. And many Southerners did, many spies, all kinds of eccentric at best people. Lincoln insisted that he have no guards. People argued with him endlessly about it. He said that his vice president, Hannibal Hamlin, was his best life insurance policy. Hannibal was from Maine and not a very highly regarded fellow. Lincoln said that he had a life insurance policy worth half the prairie land of Illinois in the person of Hannibal Hamlin. The Bucktails camped out behind the White House while they were on duty there. Tad loved them. They loved Tad. He'd come home full of campfire soot to his mother, to predictable results. They adopted him as their honorary colonel and gave him a full-bore uniform in which he posed as if he were McClellan himself. And in fact, for a long time thereafter, he signed his letters Colonel Tad Lincoln. Briefly on Mrs. Lincoln's refurbishment, this is a wax figure of Mrs. Lincoln at the Presidential Library and Museum. They change the dresses often. They are all either actual dresses of Mrs. Lincoln's or very close reproductions. One of the first things Mrs. Lincoln did when she became First Lady was to go to New York and buy goods for the White House. There was a budget at the time of $20,000 annually, or rather for a 4-year term. $20,000 for a 4-year term for all furnishings, furniture, refurbishments, whatever, at the White House, which is a lot of money in those days. And Mrs. Lincoln spent it in less than a week and actually exceeded it and ran up the tab to $28,000 in about a week. I get the numbers here. She ordered in New York $3,195 worth of china. That was 398 pieces of china. That figure would be about $150,000 worth of china today. 700 pieces of hand-cut glassware, similarly priced. Rugs, furniture. When she moved into the White House, the best piece of furniture in it was the president's bed, which was split down the middle. The headboard was split down the middle. She bought this hand-carved mahogany bed for him. It was later put into the Prince of Wales room that I mentioned earlier. All kinds of beautiful hand-carved mahogany furniture, just lavish redecoration. This was, again, Buchanan's office at the time Lincoln started, and he kept it as such for the first couple of years of his administration. This is that same room after Mrs. Lincoln finished it. This is a painting done by an artist called Peter Waddell, very talented man who specializes in this kind of thing. You can see the maps on the wall. The maps would be covered, the walls would be covered with maps throughout Lincoln's presidency, and Hay said that you could tell where the trouble was going to come next by which map was up on the wall. You can see the cabinet table there in the middle, where the cabinet sat and had sat for generations of presidents. Over there is the desk that we mentioned before. Here you can see the kind of half stub of the Washington Monument and this beautiful carpeting, beautiful wallpaper, cornices. Big bucks being spent on this at the time. This is a tableau at the Abraham Lincoln Library showing you what that room would have looked like in use. That cabinet secretary on the left may be thinking about the budget. This is now what is called, again, Lincoln's bedroom. It never was Lincoln's bedroom, but the fireplace is still in that room, the original fireplace. And it was it had become quite a grand room, but Lincoln treated it just as badly as he had treated the old one. Papers everywhere, prototype weapons everywhere, piles of books, whatever he was dealing with at the time. He all but threw it over his shoulder, and he would somehow be able to find things. There was no file room at all. Any files that you had were in your office, and you found a way to organize them. Lincoln's Secretary of State, William Seward, a terrific character, very interesting, funny, charming guy. A wealthy upstate New York aristocrat, and as Hay said, like the true aristocrat, he didn't care what he looked like. He would wear just worn, frayed cuffs and collars, the suit that he graduated from college in. One of the reporters said when Seward was among these diplomats that he would deal with in receptions, in those days they would wear cocked hats and decorations and ribbons and gold braid and all this formal attire. And Seward looked like a molting barnyard fowl among peacocks, according to the Republic. When cabinet meetings were held, you can't see it in this photograph actually, but Seward would typically lay down on the couch and smoke a cigar while he was discussing affairs of state. The other most famous of Lincoln's cabinet secretaries, Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, a fierce, formidable character that would just spit bullets at everybody who came within his wingspan. John Hay was once asked by Nicolay, his boss, to go and ask a favor of Stanton for a constituent, to which Hay said, "I would rather make the tour of a smallpox hospital." Mrs. Lincoln gathered around her at the White House a kind of a entourage, the sort of salon that she started very early on. And regrettably enough, many unscrupulous men took gross advantage of her by getting into her confidence, flattering her, charming her, and then learning secrets about what was going on in the administration on which they could trade on Wall Street. Some of them were agents of newspapers that were sent in to gather news from her and basically to do whatever they could to take advantage of that. The worst of these was this fellow by the name of Wyckoff, who was a notorious character at the time, styled himself the Chevalier Wyckoff. He was from upstate New York, but had traveled in Europe and spent a good deal of time there. And as the book said, he was born in Philadelphia, expelled from Yale as a boy, reviled on 2 continents as a man. The Chevalier Wyckoff, as he liked to hear himself called, had bounced around high society as a sort of professional cad. By what means, few could say, a newspaper man recounted. That awful creature Wyckoff, William Howard Russell called him, of the Times of London. Hay called him an unclean bird, Hay thought it an enduring disgrace to American society that it suffers such a thing to be around. I wish he could be hit by lightning. Another one of these characters was General Dan Sickles, formerly Congressman Dan Sickles, who had been a minister in London and had presented his mistress to Queen Victoria, came back to this country, and his tolerance for sexual liberty kind of ended where his wife's began. His wife had an affair with the son of Francis Scott Key. Dan Sickles shot him dead on Pennsylvania Avenue, a pistol shot from the White House, and got away with it on a plea of temporary insanity. You can imagine a jury of all men being told that he was temporarily insane when he found out that his wife had had an affair with another man, but Dan's affairs didn't count. Another member of Mrs. Lincoln's salon was the Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner, another Yankee blue blood, well regarded in a lot of ways, but totally humorless, pompous, affected an Oxford accent, very unpopular with Lincoln. Lincoln once said of Sumner, "We don't have many bishops down where I come from, but I always think of Sumner as a bishop." All of those characters and more were invited to a grand party at the White House in 1862, which was the event of the year on the social calendar. There were strict rules against having private parties in the White House, informal, not written anywhere, but just by protocol. The problem being that whoever got invited was thrilled and whoever didn't get invited was not thrilled. And you couldn't get but so many people in the White House. So Seward cautioned Mrs. Lincoln strictly not to do it. Mrs. Lincoln did do it, spent a grotesque amount of money on this party, had it catered by the fanciest caterer in New York. I don't have time to read you the list of the food and confections and decorations and bands and huge expense that was put into this thing. It was In fact, exactly what Seward had predicted. The people who were invited were thrilled and delighted, and everybody else was beside themselves with envy and anger, which did Lincoln no good politically. This is from the Lincoln Museum and Library, typical of the dresses that were worn at the time. And you can imagine the size of these dresses. Some of them had 25 yards of silk built into them, and they were held up by whalebone or steel cages under these dresses. They weren't just flowing there, they were actually supported by these strict, very strong cage structures. One general said that if Mrs. Lincoln ever got attacked at a reception, her ladies-in-waiting could just form a barrier with those steel and whalebone skirts and stop an assassin in his tracks. One of the people at this party was Kate Chase, the daughter of the Secretary of the Treasury, the belle of Washington at the time. She was 22 years old. She was sort of the Kardashian of her day. Every move she made was followed. Everyone thought she was the most beautiful woman in the city. Hay said he disagreed. He said she was only a little more lovely than any other woman. Unfortunately, the very night of this grand party, Willie Lincoln fell sick with typhoid fever. This is a tableau from the Lincoln Museum. Poor Mrs. Lincoln shuttling back and forth from this grand party that she had, planned for 6 months and was going to be the highlight of her life. Turned out to be a nightmare of an experience. Willie Lincoln survived the night but died 2 days later at the age of 12. This, of course, was a common thing at the time, but no less heartbreaking. Tad got sick of typhoid fever as well, and was in the same sick room with Willie and also near death for those 2 days, but did survive. Mrs. Lincoln was in mourning for the rest of her life after this event, and was sure that God had punished her for the sin of pride, is the way she put it. This having happened literally on the night of this grand ball. The Lincolns, by the way, were totally castigated for this ball in the press. One of the papers said it was like a man having a party with a coffin in the house, with a civil war going on. Many thousands of boys and men living in the mud, eating hardtack, did not go over well politically or any other way. Not long after Willie's death, Mary's half-sister came to live with her in the White House. You can see her, a young woman here, also in widow's garb. Her husband had been killed a week or two before that at the Battle of Chickamauga, and the complication was that he was killed in the Confederate Army. Of all of Mrs. Lincoln's half-sisters, 3 of them were married to officers in the Confederate Army, and 4 of her half-brothers were in the Confederate Army. 3 of them were killed, which I think brings home the personal tragedy of this catastrophic war. Not to dwell on this, but in our own time, or my own time, we lost 55,000 dead in Vietnam, which was a terrible thing. The current estimate of the dead in the Civil War is about 750,000 on both sides, with a population about 10% of the size of ours. So it's just unimaginable tragedy. Anyway, there's a chapter in the book about this visit of Emily Helm, as her name was, to the White House. She stayed with Mrs. Lincoln for about 10 days in the heart of the Civil War. Everybody in town knew it. That little rebel, as she was called, by some of Lincoln's friends as well as his enemies. And there's a story in the book about Lincoln confronting them and telling them that people shouldn't presume to tell him who his house guests should be. Unfortunately, Emily went home to Kentucky with about her weight worth of quinine, which was the only medicine available to treat malaria, and was given directly to the Confederate Army to help their sick soldiers get back on the battlefield. She also brought home in her luggage a new uniform for Robert E. Lee, which was not well regarded by the president either. Briefly on the issue of race that I talked about before, this is Frederick Douglass, who came to the White House several times to meet with Lincoln. It was the only time that a black leader, and Douglass was a very famous black leader at the time, abolitionist, who had ever been invited to the White House. Lincoln also invited many of the local black clergy to come to the White House to confer with him about racial issues, to have prayer meetings and such, completely unheard of. He had black people invited to White House social functions. They ultimately began to come of their own accord. They would be allowed in after the white people had passed through the reception line. But, you know, in 1863, 64, this was absolutely shocking behavior. Lincoln, throughout his presidency, opened the White House to black visitors, to black office seekers, appointed many of them, using the White House as a platform for that kind of forced movement to not only free slaves, but also to integrate black people into the life of the nation. On the entertainment side, the Lincolns had entertainment and parties and guests just as we did, as we do today in the White House. This is P.T. Barnum and his star attraction, General Tom Thumb, who some of you may have heard of, who was the star of the day. And both of them visited the White House. Mrs. Lincoln had a reception for Tom Thumb and his wife after they were married. Barnum also had a character similar who was an admiral, supposedly, whose trade name or stage name was Admiral Nutt. And Admiral Nutt made $30,000 a year. The President of the United States made $25,000 a year. The newspapers called him Barnum's $30,000 nut. There was a group called the Hutchinson Family Singers, who were the big star attraction singers of their day. You can see their names, actually you can't see it probably, but their names are under their pictures, kind of like John, Paul, George, and Ringo. They came and found that the piano was out of tune and unusable, so they had to go get a harmonium out of their carriage and bring it in to use it. Nobody had ever tuned the piano. Lincoln had a magician called Herman the Prestidigitator, who later became Herman the Great. You can see him taking counsel from the devil and the little imps there about his tricks at the time. This was very wildly popular as well. General McClellan, who was a terrific enemy of Lincoln's politically, as some of you may know, was at that event, and he writes in his diary that Herman the Prestidigitator came up to Lincoln and asked him for a handkerchief for his trick, and Lincoln said, "Well, you got me now, I ain't got one." As McClellan says, this from the Commander-in-Chief of our great republic. Julia Ward Howe came to the White House to recite poetry and essays that she had written, which Hay thought were terrific, and writes in his diary how interesting these were, except for one called Moral Trigonometry, whatever that may mean, because he couldn't figure that one out. Walt Whitman came to the White House several times. A fellow poet of Hay's, he struck up a friendship with Hay. Always wanted to speak to the president, shake his hand, but every time he came, Lincoln would be engaged with somebody else or a friend, and he just didn't feel like he wanted to intrude, so he never did. But he was a government office clerk at the time, as he made his bread, and often would be walking down the street when Lincoln passed in his carriage. And he said, "We've gotten so that I nod to him, and I bow to him, and he nods to me and tips his hat to me. So we've gotten to be sort of friends after a fashion." General Grant came to the White House famously in 1864 after he was the great American hero that he became. There was such a tumult at the reception where Grant appeared that he had to be surrounded by cavalrymen who formed what one of them later called a football wedge to drive him through the crowd. He was told to stand up on a sofa so that he wouldn't be hurt and so that people could see him. One of the aides said that he looked scared on top of that couch. Ralph Waldo Emerson came to the White House. There's a vignette about him in the book and his entertainments with Willie and Tad. Vinnie Ream was a teenage wonder of her time, a sculptress who was brought into Lincoln's office and sculpted his bust while he worked and while she worked on her work. She was 16 years old at the time, another big celebrity of the day. Seances were held at the White House. It was a very popular thing at the time. Spiritualism had gained a big following with all of these tragic deaths, people trying to console themselves, get in touch with their loved ones. Mrs. Lincoln, after Willie's death, had at least 5 or 6 seances in the Red Room at the White House. And the evidence is pretty compelling that Lincoln went to at least 2 of those. George Nicolay tried to pass it off as just a casual interest if it happened, but there's pretty good evidence that Lincoln was also looking for consolation. He once told an officer 2 years after Willie's death, kind of looking out the window wistfully, "Do you ever talk to the dead, Colonel? You know, you must have lost a lot of friends." He said, "Every day I find myself talking to Willie." So the evidence is quite strong that Lincoln participated in that as well. At the end of the day, the surrender of Lee in April of 1865 was a grand celebration in Washington. There were fireworks displays. There were 300 gun salute from artillery massed in Lafayette Square. And kind of interesting fact, I think, before dark, Stanton arranged to have a man at every window of the White House with a candle, and every window of the War Department and every window of the State Department, so that all these 3 big buildings had a man with a candle at the window, and they put fireballs and limelights on the lawns in front of all 3 buildings. And when the Marine Band struck up the Star-Spangled Banner, every man lit his candle, and suddenly all the windows were illuminated as if by magic. People were, you know, awed by that. This is 19th century illumination. As we all know, Lincoln's death followed very soon thereafter, just about 4 days after Lee surrendered. This is the White House draped in mourning under the portico. There's, of course, a chapter in the book about that. A period of time in which Hay said everything seemed to weep. I think everybody in this room, or almost everybody, is old enough to remember Kennedy's assassination and what a blow that was. And this was very similar, in fact, maybe even more devastating. It happened literally a few days after Lee's surrender on Good Friday, at a time when most people were very religious and saw this as very fraught with meaning. The funeral took place in the East Room. Just as in Kennedy's funeral, thousands of people passed by the bier for about 3 days. After Lincoln's death, Vice President Johnson, now President Johnson, was approached by Nicolay and asked whether Mrs. Lincoln could stay in the White House for a period of time to make the adjustment. And he said, of course, that she could. He stayed in a hotel, worked out of the Treasury Department in an office that had the flags outside it from the box at Ford's Theater where Lincoln had been shot. And the book ends as, it may be a good place to end for us this evening, with an epilogue that tells what happened to all the characters, what their lives were like afterward, briefly, what became of them. John Hay, on the left there, a little bit older now, in 1865 with a mustache, became Secretary of State under Teddy Roosevelt. Therefore wound up working for 2 of the 4 heads on Mount Rushmore, and died relatively young at the age of 61, and had kept a very close personal diary every day on which the book draws heavily. And I'll just read you briefly the ending that deals with Hay's epilogue. A diarist to the end, Hay made an entry in 1905, less than 3 weeks before he died. I dreamt last night that I was in Washington and that I went to the White House to report to the president, who turned out to be Mr. Lincoln. He was very kind and considerate and sympathetic about my illness. He said there was little work of importance on hand. He gave me 2 unimportant letters to answer. I was pleased that this slight order was within my power to obey. I was not in the least surprised by Lincoln's presence in the White House, but the whole impression of the dream was one of overpowering melancholy. I wish I could write like that. And the last thing I'll show you is the gut renovation of the White House in 1949, the year I was born, when Harry Truman moved across the street to Blair House and literally had the White House dismantled from the inside out. Not a lot of people know that. Held up by steel girders and completely trashed. There was just nothing to be done with the condition of the floors, the ceilings. Chandeliers were beginning to sway when people walked above them. There was a big reception in the East Room of diplomats, and the chandelier was going like that. Truman said, we can't have this. So they completely gutted it out, rebuilt it from the inside out. And what we see now today is actually a board-for-board recreation of what the White House did look like, but completely rebuilt. Larry, this would be a project for you to go fund. And that's my story. I appreciate your time.